The North Atlantic is a graveyard of ambitions, a grey and pitiless expanse where the wind howls with the ghosts of 1,000 years of maritime struggle. In May of 1941, this desolate theatre became the stage for a drama that would shatter the British psyche and redefine the nature of naval warfare. At the heart of this tragedy stood a ship that was more than just steel and steam. The HMS Hood was the embodiment of an empire, a floating cathedral of British prestige that had spent 2 decades as the most famous warship on the planet. To the men who sailed her, she was the mighty Hood. To the world, she was the visible symbol of the Pax Britannica. But symbols are fragile things when confronted by the cold reality of industrial evolution. As the Hood patrolled the frigid waters between Iceland and Greenland, she was already a relic of a bygone age, a beautiful but flawed masterpiece of the Great War era. Her nemesis was rising from the south, a vessel born of a different philosophy and a darker intent. The German battleship Bismarck was not merely a ship, she was a predatory statement of intent, a 50,000-ton engineering marvel designed to sever the lifeline of the British Isles. The collision of these two icons would not just be a battle of guns, but a collision of eras. The prelude to the disaster began in the Baltic, where the Bismarck and her consort, the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, slipped away under the cover of a northern spring. Operation Rheinübung was a gamble by the German High Command to unleash their most powerful surface assets into the Atlantic convoy lanes. If the Bismarck could break out, she could paralyze the British supply lines, forcing the Royal Navy to divert its entire fleet to protect the merchantmen. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, a man of stoic duty and tactical caution, knew the risks were monumental. He was entering a cage where the British held the keys, but he possessed a weapon that the British had yet to truly comprehend. On the morning of May 23, the radar operators aboard the heavy cruisers HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk peered through the sleet of the Denmark Strait. They were the eyes of the fleet, equipped with new technology that promised to peel back the veil of the Atlantic fog. When the blips finally appeared on their screens, it was a moment of cold realization. The Bismarck was out. The hunt had begun. The news raced across the airwaves to Admiral Lancelot Holland, aboard the Hood, who was steaming at flank speed to intercept. Holland was a man of the old school, steeped in the traditions of the Royal Navy, yet he was acutely aware that his flagship carried a secret shame beneath her majestic silhouette. The systemic failure that led to the tragedy of the Hood was rooted in the design philosophy of the Battlecruiser. Conceived by Lord Fisher before the First World War, the Battlecruiser was built on the principle that speed was armor. They were designed to hunt down cruisers and outrun anything they could and outfight. But at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, 3 British battlecruisers had vanished in cataclysmic explosions, victims of thin deck armor that could not withstand the plunging fire of long-range shells. The Hood was intended to fix these flaws, but her construction was interrupted by the end of the war, and her armor was never truly upgraded to meet the terrifying power of 15-inch modern projectiles. She was a ship with a glass jaw, dressed in the finery of a champion. As the two forces closed the distance in the early hours of May 24, the tactical disaster began to take shape. Admiral Holland, perhaps fearing the Bismarck's superior fire control at long range, decided to close the distance as rapidly as possible. He ordered a high-speed approach that would minimize the time his ships were exposed to plunging fire. However, this maneuver forced the Hood and the newly commissioned Prince of Wales to approach at an angle that masked their own rear turrets. The British were charging into the fray with half their firepower silenced, while the Germans were able to bring their full broadsides to bear. The confusion of battle is a fog that no radar can fully pierce. In the opening minutes of the engagement, the British made a critical error in identification. From their perspective, the Prinz Eugen, which was leading the German line, bore a striking resemblance to the Bismarck. Holland ordered his ships to target the leading vessel. It was only minutes into the exchange that the error was realized, but by then, the Germans had already found their range. The Prinz Eugen struck the Hood's boat deck, igniting a fire among the anti-aircraft ammunition. A terrifying wall of flame erupted amidships, a signal fire that illuminated the target for the Bismarck's gunners. On the bridge of the Bismarck, Captain Ernst Lindemann and his gunnery officer, Adalbert Schneider, were calm. They were using a sophisticated stereoscopic range-finding system that was the pinnacle of German optics. The fifth salvo from the Bismarck was the one that changed history. At a distance of roughly 9 miles, a 15-inch shell, weighing nearly a ton, arched through the sky and struck the Hood near her mainmast. It didn't an appos, just hit the ship, it found the very heart of her. The shell bypassed the side armor and tore through the thin deck plating, plunging directly into the after magazines where hundreds of tons of cordite were stored. The explosion was not a sound, it was an erasure. A massive pillar of fire, reaching 1,000 feet into the air, tore the Hood in two. Witnesses on the Prince of Wales described the sight as something beyond the realm of warfare, a physical impossibility. The stern of the mighty Hood rose into the air and vanished into the smoke. The bow stayed upright for a few moments, her forward guns firing one last, defiant salvo as she was swallowed by the Atlantic. In less than 3 minutes, the pride of the Royal Navy had vanished. Of the 1,421 men on board, only 3 survived. They were left bobbing in the freezing water, surrounded by the debris of an empire, watching as the Bismarck steamed on, seemingly invincible. The psychological shockwaves hit London like a physical blow. Winston Churchill, a man not easily shaken, understood that the loss of the Hood was more than a military setback, it was a wound to the British soul. The order was issued with a cold, unrelenting fury: sink the Bismarck. The Royal Navy, wounded and humiliated, mobilized every asset in the North Atlantic. Battleships were pulled from convoy duty, destroyers were pushed to their mechanical limits, and carriers were brought up from the Mediterranean. The hunt was no longer about strategy, it was about vengeance. Yet, the Bismarck was not unscathed. A shell from the Prince of Wales had pierced her bow, causing a fuel leak and a slight list. Admiral Lutyens, realizing his mission was compromised, turned for the safety of occupied France. For a brief window, it seemed he might escape. The British lost contact in the shifting mists, and for 30 hours, the Bismarck was a ghost in the vastness of the ocean. It was here that the unsung heroes of the story emerged. Not the admirals in their heated cabins, but the young pilots of the Coastal Command and the radar operators who refused to sleep. On the morning of May 26, a Catalina flying boat, piloted by an American ensign named Leonard Smith, spotted the telltale oil slick. The Bismarck was found, but she was only hours away from the protection of the German Luftwaffe and U-boats. The British battleships were too far behind to catch her. The only hope lay with the HMS Ark Royal and her squadron of obsolete aircraft. The Fairy Swordfish was a biplane made of wood, wire, and canvas. It looked like a relic from 1918, string bag, that seemed laughable against the modern anti-aircraft batteries of a German Titan. But in the irony of history, it was the primitive that would undo the sophisticated. The attack of the Swordfish pilots in the fading light of May 26 is one of the most harrowing chapters in naval history. Flying through a wall of flak so intense it should have shredded their canvas wings, the pilots dropped their torpedoes just feet above the waves. Most of the hits did little more than dent the Bismarck's massive belt armor. But one torpedo, dropped by a pilot who refused to veer away, struck the very rear of the ship. It was a 1 in a million hit. The explosion jammed the Bismarck's twin rudders at a 15-degree turn. In that moment, the Bismarck's fate was sealed. She was no longer a predator, she was a wounded animal circling in the dark. Lutyens sent a final, haunting radio message to Berlin: ship unmaneuverable. We shall fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. The German crew, who had cheered the sinking of the Hood only days before, now realized they were trapped in a steel coffin. They spent the night in a state of suspended animation, listening to the sound of British destroyers harrying them in the darkness, waiting for the dawn that would bring their executioners. The final battle on the morning of May 27 was not a duel, it was a slaughter. The British battleships King George V and Rodney closed in, their heavy guns systematically dismantling the Bismarck's superstructure. They fired at point-blank range, turning the German ship into a charnel house of twisted metal and fire. Yet, the Bismarck's hull held. Her armor was so thick that the British shells could not sink her quickly enough. It was only when the German crew began scuttling procedures and British cruisers moved in to fire torpedoes that the Titan finally rolled over and slipped beneath the waves. As the Bismarck vanished, taking over 2,000 men with her, the era of the battleship died. The struggle in the Denmark Strait had proven that the most expensive, most powerful surface vessels were vulnerable to a single shell or a single biplane. The world had moved into the age of the carrier, the age of the long-range missile, and the age of total industrial attrition. The loss of 3,500 lives in less than a week was a grim testament to the fact that in the modern world, courage and prestige were no match for the cold calculations of technology and logistics. The tragedy of the Hood and the Bismarck remains a haunting philosophical takeaway on the nature of power. Both ships were built to project strength, to intimidate, and to dominate. Yet both ended their journeys as broken shells on the ocean floor, reminders of the fleeting nature of human glory. The sea does not care for the pedigree of a ship or the medals on a captain's chest. It only knows the weight of the steel and the silence of the deep. In the quiet halls of history, we remember the names of the ships, but we must also remember the men who were caught in the gears of these massive machines. From the 1,418 who vanished in a heartbeat aboard the Hood to the thousands who went down with the Bismarck, they were the fuel for a fire they did not light. Their story is a warning that even the mightiest icons can be brought low by a single flaw, and that the ocean remains the ultimate arbiter of all human vanity. The waves of the Atlantic still roll over the sites where the Hood and the Bismarck rest. They lie in the eternal dark, miles apart, yet forever linked by those 5 days in May. The prestige, the fury, and the fire have all been washed away, leaving only the cold, silent truth of the deep. The era of the Titans has passed, but the echoes of their guns still vibrate through the halls of time, a somber melody for a world that learned, at a terrible cost, that no ship is truly invincible. The mighty Hood and the Bismarck, once the masters of the horizon, are now merely shadows in the abyss, surrendered to the sea that claimed them both.